As a salesperson, won't repeat some of the ones I've said before, but look, remember that you're selling to human beings that have needs, desires, ups and downs, good days, bad days. I think part of your job as a salesperson is part psychologist and part problem solver. Don't forget you're part psychologist. There's a lot you can do to help your prospect and customer by empathizing with them, understanding what motivates them, really be there for them. And I think I've had an interaction with a pretty senior security officer at one of the major banks in the last couple of weeks. And my message was, look, I'd love to talk to you about whether I can solve a problem for you.
Welcome to GrowthPulse, the B2B sales podcast. You might be a salesperson. You could lead a sales team. Maybe you run a business or you're a battle-tested entrepreneur. Then we built this podcast for you. Great salespeople are built, not bought. We learn so much from the deals we win, but we learn even more from the deals we lose. In each episode, we bring you some of the world's leading salespeople, sales leaders, and experts in sales tech to share their best lessons from both their wins and their losses. Before we start, please check out the screen of your phone or laptop, and if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you've clicked subscribe and press that like button down below. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple, click the plus sign to follow so we can let you know when we publish each new episode. If you like the episode, drop us a comment with any questions about the show. We'd love to get to know our audience. Great businesses always feature world-class salespeople, and the best salespeople are always learning. So let's jump in. Welcome back to another episode of GrowthPulse, the B2B sales podcast. I am Dan Bartels, and I'm here with Simon Peterson. How are you, buddy?
Very well, thanks, mate. We're coming to the end of the year, so 6 weeks of selling left before a new year starts.
Mate, it is.
Crazy.
Yeah. Mate, we're going to do a bit differently. We haven't got a guest today, and I think there's an opportunity. We don't really give each other enough credit for the stuff we've done in our past. I think it's a good opportunity for us to jump in and talk to each other about what we've done and some of our wins and losses. But I think it's also worthwhile us taking a second and really reintroducing ourselves and our backgrounds to our audience. Mate, so look, why don't you take a second and just jump through. You've had a pretty illustrious sales career and technology career in particular, but let's take a bit of a trip down memory lane. And what was your background?
Sure. I came into sales like most salespeople by accident. I did a computer science degree at New South Wales Uni, and I went into that by accident as well. So it's interesting. I remember finishing high school and looking at my HSC mark going, that's not quite as much as I thought I was going to get. And my mum sat me down and said, yeah, you like computers, don't you? Why don't you go do that? So that's how I got into computer science, which is interesting. And then I finished uni and the cricket was on, and I spent that summer painting houses. It was awesome. I had no idea about what I wanted to do. For those people that are going through their university and jumping into a career and they're wondering what the hell I'm going to do, you're not alone. And it's funny, parents are great for advice. My dad saw me up the top of a 2-story ladder painting his house, enjoying not having a career probably a little bit too much. And that was back in the days when job ads were actually in newspapers, and he tore out a job ad for me. He said, mate, you should probably have a look at this. Some software company needs to hire some graduates. Okay, no problem. And I went along for the interview at the recruiter, and it was really interesting. It sounded fascinating, the role that they were pitching me for, but then they said it was a German company that no one had ever heard of. And I said, oh, Lordy, it's not the Silicon Valley that I had mentally pictured in the back of my mind, and went along, and lo and behold, that was SAP back in 1994. And what do you want to do? I've just finished this degree and we're hiring 5 or 6 graduates, and I must have said something right because they hired me as a programmer of all things. And honestly, I was not a very good programmer. I was okay, but the guy next to me was always better than me. So I moved into consulting, and that was really interesting. What do you want to be a consultant in? I looked at what SAP did. I said, I'll do accounting. They said, have you got any accounting background? I said, no, but I'll learn it. And that was really interesting. Back in the days, I would sit down and learn from all of the consultants around me and figure it all out. And I remember teaching an academy for GSIs back in the day, and we had the Anderson Consulting and the Deloitte and Touche, and most of those don't exist anymore. But I had about maybe 40 people in my class, and I had to teach them cost accounting for SAP. And I'll never forget, there were a couple of mates of mine from high school in the audience, and they were the clever ones that went to the big consulting firms. And I remember in the first break, they said, "Mate, you never studied accounting in your life. How are you teaching accounting?" I said, "Mate, I'm 3 pages ahead in the manual and I'll do a very good job." So I think it's funny. I think the lesson there is, mate, just you got to follow your nose a little bit. And I'll
Yeah.
never forget a piece of advice someone gave me very early in my career. It's, don't look at what you can't do. Throw yourself in the deep end and you'll figure it out. And I've done that consistently. I always throw myself into the next job, and you have that holy shit moment that you go, is anyone going to find me out? Do I really know what I'm doing? And honestly, you put the hard
Yeah.
work in and you figure it out, mate. And so I ended up spending 20 years at SAP, but getting into sales was an interesting one. I'd been in Germany and Canada in various consulting gigs, and I just looked across the aisle and saw those sales guys. They were having way too much fun. And there was I stuck with implementing the stuff that they would sell. I saw the cars that they were driving. I saw the lifestyle, and I went, I don't necessarily want to emulate all of that ego, but I absolutely wanted to try my hand in it. And I remember my boss was the COO at the time, and I said, "Mate, we've just acquired this thing called business objects, and each of your AEs has 12 million euro target, and these average deal size of these business objects analytics deals are about 300K, and we're losing a lot of them." And I was the ops guy back then. I'd studied a lot about what we were winning and losing, and I said, "Mate, give me a team and I'll go after the small deals." And he said, "Sure." And so I got a team of 11 reps, went and hired them, many of whom those original hires you probably know. Andy Brokoff, Alex Train,
Yeah.
amongst a lot of others. Tim Woodman was in there. There was a lot of people that have gone
Yeah.
on to have amazing sales careers post that. But yeah, we sold a lot of software. I think the first 3 years, the worst I did was about 230% of my number. And that was when I realized I could probably do this sales and sales
Not a bad
leadership
outcome.
thing.
Yeah.
Absolutely. No, it was an awesome experience. And I think that's a testament to throwing yourself in the deep end. I'd never been an AE before. I'd watched AEs for over 10 years doing what they're doing. I'd been in pre-sales. I'd done a whole bunch of bits and pieces. And I thought to myself, rather than teach people how to do it, why don't I go do it? And I loved it, every second of it. And to be honest with you, I think the consulting background really set me up in good stead, because it was really about thinking about the problem you're trying to solve. How's the company going to absorb the change? And what are the key things you think about when you have a massive change effort? And I think as you implement ERP, it's a sort of a heart lung transplant. You've got to absolutely think through, what's the implication? Who are the stakeholders? What have they got to gain and lose? And I think that
Yeah.
was some of the fundamental things at the beginning of my sales career. I know you very much focus on the problem we're trying to solve.
Yeah. I think even the way you went through your journey to get to understanding like how to pull apart problems and how to then experience when someone's not diagnosed what the real problem is
Mm.
at its core. It is the reason that people engage in solutions, right? It's the reason people buy anything.
Yep.
People often focus too much when they talk about, I want to build a product-led growth company. Yeah, but the product still solves a really core problem the customer has.
Mhm.
They're not buying it just because the product is cool. The customer, even when you go and buy dinner overnight, you buy it because you're hungry.
Mm.
Or you take someone to a fancy restaurant because it's your partner's and your anniversary.
Mm.
Otherwise, you're not going there. So it's, you go to the pub because you're hanging out with your mates.
Yep.
So like it's understanding those use cases, the problem that particular delivery solves at the time, and then how to fit that to the right customers. And I think people too often in business don't get that. They don't really break it down to what it looks like.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's really interesting. And I think the next stage of my career, that was probably after 20 years at SAP, it was its early 2010s. And I looked at SAP, fantastic company, hell of a training ground. I'd lived in Germany and Canada and spent time in Australia. Some great relationships, great friends, great learnings. But I saw the SaaS juggernaut really taking off. And I'll never forget somebody that a lot of these people that listen to this podcast may know, Paul Appleby, who was a bit of a legend in the early days of SAP, but he was over at Salesforce, and he quite cleverly, and this is a good tip for people that are trying to hire salespeople, he rang me about 4:30 on the last day of a quarter, said, "Mate, how's your day going? And he knew damn well what day it was. He knew it was the last day of my quarter. How's it going? I said, a bit stressful, can't really talk. He said, mate, just give me 5 minutes. And he pitched me and he said, mate, you've been in SAP for a long time. I bet you're keen to get into SaaS. And I went, yeah, where are you? And he said, Salesforce. I said, oh, it's a one-trick pony company, a bit of a Mickey Mouse CRM software. Coming out of the SAP world where we tried to do all things for all people. And thankfully, I took his advice and came on, and I absolutely loved my time at Salesforce. I started in an ops role of all things, and he promised me within sort of 9 months I'd be back in sales leadership, and sure enough, that's what happened. And I had an awesome time at Salesforce. That's obviously where we met. And selling Salesforce back in those sort of early to mid 2010s and then up until the end of 2019, 20, et cetera. What a ride it was. I think it was a unique sort of a company coming up with spectacular solutions at a time when a market really needed those solutions, and a transaction model that made a heck of a lot of sense as a service, and right things at the right time. And I've got to say, surrounded by some incredibly clever people. That's another thing. As you look at your career, the most important thing, or one of the most important things, is surround yourself with smart people that you're learning from every day. And they might be working for you. You might be working for them. There are a lot of smart people that give you great ideas about how to do things. And I think as I went through that journey, an amazing experience. I had some ups and downs. I don't think anyone that's ever worked at Salesforce hasn't had a few ups and a few downs. It's a tricky environment. I loved it. And then I moved to Financial Force, which is now Satinia. And I guess the rest is history. But that was ERP and professional services automation on Salesforce's platform. So for me, it was fantastic. It brought all that background in ERP together with what Salesforce does around CRM, and in a neat little package. And what a wonderful 7 years I had there. That was outstanding fun. Growing a business. When I joined the company, I was a little bit hesitant. It didn't have a wonderful reputation in Australia. It was seen as too difficult to work with.
I remember that. Yeah.
A bit of a hobby for Financial Force, having a region in Asia Pac. I joined, and there's probably 2 or 3 people, and in a little service office somewhere, and it was pretty toxic culture. The sales team reported into somebody in the US, which is problematic because you can't have a bunch of people trying to learn and engage in a local culture and a local sales environment. When your boss is 12,000 miles away in a different time zone, it's very difficult to breed that culture. And I'll never forget the first day I started, I almost had to break up a fight between the sales guys and the service guys. And I knew I had my job cut out for me. But then things came together. We hired a lot of spectacular people and grew that business, I think 10, 15-fold when we were there.
Yeah, it was outrageous growth. Yeah.
It was a lot of fun, eh?
In a 5-year period that I was there, it was the growth was, I think it was 10x plus. We were doing 3 or 4x each year to go year on year. And look, and it wasn't without its massive challenges early on. Mm-hmm. So I think there's definitely some lessons we can talk about there in the path of the session today.
Tons of lessons.
And you've now stepped into kind of the security world, which is a bit different, or the data storage world.
It's an interesting one, mate. Look, I started in ERP. That was very much back office, then CRM, very much front office. And just thinking through, how do you continue to challenge yourself and grow? I never thought of myself as someone that'd be selling plumbing. And it's quite a technical problem that you're solving. But I think one of the things I bring to it is there's always a business problem. So we're in data protection. I think certainly in the last 6-8 weeks in Australia, it's been pretty apparent that data protection is front and center. You look at Claire O'Neill announcing the cybersecurity strategy at a federal level. You look at what's happened to DP World, Optus, et cetera. And CEOs have been ousted over it. Companies have been brought to a standstill. And I think security, data protection together is something that I hadn't done before, but I'm loving the challenge. And I think one of the things I'm bringing to it is I joined a team that was very used to selling at an infrastructure level. And that's just not my background. And one of the questions I asked myself a few weeks into it is, what's the problem we're solving? We're not selling my widget's better than your widget. There are a lot of different data protection companies out there, and a lot of them are very good, but how do I differentiate myself? And I thought to myself, if I'm protecting data or backing up or providing security, it's not necessarily just about security. It's about the value of the data that I'm protecting. So For example, one of the things we protect is Salesforce data. And traditionally, you could say, are you backing up your Salesforce data? That's a pretty dry old conversation, to be honest with you. Backup's boring. But if you have a conversation about what's the value of your Salesforce data, you've got every customer interaction, every sales service and marketing interaction, where your revenue comes from, propensity to spend, all of that stuff that chief revenue officers live and breathe. Is that of value to you as an organization? And that is an interesting conversation. So I think looking at the workloads that we are protecting and the value of those, and fundamentally, it's not about can you back up? It's also fundamentally about uptime, speed of recovery.
Yeah.
And if you lose your data, your business comes to an enormous
Grinding
stand.
hole. Yeah.
And I think let's look forward for a second. You look at Salesforce's world. I know a lot of our listeners are in that world. You look at data cloud and AI that Salesforce is coming out with. Many other companies are doing the same thing. You've got Databricks and the Snowflakes doing data lakes. And what does it tell you? It tells you that the data that feeds AI and analytics and decision making in order to deliver a better outcome to customers, it's all about data. And if you're not protecting that data and you're not valuing that data, you're just out of business. And I think fundamentally that for me is an exciting next step. I've done back office, front office, and now I'm trying to protect the office, which is an interesting
way to think about it.
Yeah. And I guess if you think about cyber resilience, cyber security, one of the interesting things I've discovered is a cyber attack on a business is not a one-time event. Typically it begins with phishing, might click on a link, they build a profile of the organization, the people in there. It could be 9-10 months between the first phishing attack and the actual cyber attack. And so it's a long drawn out process. And I think you also need to think about what are they trying to achieve when they're trying to disrupt your business? There's pure maliciousness. There's all sorts of different actors. But one of the things I've discovered is if you're going to try and take a business offline, one of the first places you disable is their backup, because you destroy their production system and they've got a decent data protection strategy.
Just sort it out. Yeah.
They'll sort it out. And that's interesting. Deep into what I'm doing today, but it's fascinating. It's different. And as I say to my team, backup's boring, but data protection is not boring. It's front and center. And I think as the next couple of years, it'll just get more and more fundamental, and you'll see boards resigning, you'll see CEOs resigning, you'll see CIOs looking for jobs if they don't get this stuff right. And interestingly, that's a dialogue I'm having right now. And honestly, the biggest organizations in Australia are lining up to figure out what they need to do. They don't need to buy my software, but they need to invest in a cyber resilience strategy.
For sure. It's funny, mate. You just used the frame of reference that, it can be boring. I think one of the things that I've seen, and I know I experienced this definitely when I stepped into Financial Force, right? Because we were selling back office and ERP. My perception was that's a pretty boring sale.
Yep.
Most businesses are pretty boring. What they solve are not necessarily all that exciting.
Yep.
But it's when you tie stuff together and that function plus that experience, like that becomes exciting. Even if you think if you're on a theme park, all right, there's roller coasters and stuff, but what are you really doing? You're running a gate at the front and a concession stand. It's a corner store and a turnstile. It's a pretty boring business, right?
Yep.
How do you make it exciting? I think how do you turn it into the experience, or how do you turn it into the outcomes or deliverables, or what problem are you solving? Hey, we run kids' birthday parties. That's awesome. That's a really fun thing to do. It's a different way of thinking about the fact that you run a theme park. I think there's a bit, I know we've talked a lot about that over the years in terms of how do you pull the experience out, the problem out of what someone's actually doing in their business. And that's what we kind of address and attack. So it's probably a reasonable segue into kind of the purpose of today's podcast, right? Let's look back into our kind of lessons. We always drill into the lessons of our guests, but mate, what's one of the top lessons that you look at, whether it be a sales cycle or as a sales leader, that you really try and instill in your team?
There are a lot of them. I think what's interesting fundamentally for me, it's about understanding who you're selling to. And as we always say, it's about the problem you're solving. But I guess moving from the previous conversation where we were talking about it's boring or blah, 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 it's that internal bias you have. My bias against Salesforce, Mickey Mouse software, one trick pony. Why does everybody need a CRM system? I got into it. Absolutely not the case. That was
Yeah.
absolute bias. So one of the things I do see salespeople that often have bias around the problem their customer's trying to solve, have a bias around who the real power is that they're trying to sell to. They have these preconceived ideas based on office chit chat, previous
Yeah.
experience, etc. And as a result, I guess two things: be curious and always look to discover what's new. And if you do those two things, the risk of that sort of negative bias tends to go away. And we've all been in sales cycles, right? Where you get to the end of the deal, you've committed it and it's going to happen. And the person you're talking to isn't actually the person signing the check, isn't the person making the
Yeah.
decision. Oh, yeah. Look, I really like it. It's awesome. I just go to my boss and just see if it's on their radar. And as a salesperson, at the end of a sales cycle, that's
Yeah.
about as bad as you can possibly get. And as you get older, you certainly don't make those mistakes. But that's all about bias. Yeah. You're sitting there and you're listening to all of the feedback that you're getting along the way, and they're giving all the right signals, but just not talking to the right person. And boxed yourself in, everything's going well. And the old happy years conversation. That's probably the most common one. But
Is there a good story on that you can share with everyone?
I'll give you a positive one. I was in Germany at SAP, and we were doing value-based selling, and I was working with a couple of sales teams over there. I wasn't the sales guy, I wasn't the leader, I was an advisor to the team, and it was one of the largest chemical companies in Germany, and big conglomerate, massive company, reasonably big shop. And we were pitching, can't even remember what the solution was, probably analytics at the time. I was a thin slice across everything. We'd come up with the value chain of the business. We've analyzed every stakeholder. We had figured out who was to gain and lose by what was happening. We built an ROI model. We'd done everything that we could possibly have done. We presented it. I was part of the presentation presenting this model to the CIO. And the CIO said, yeah, look, that's awesome. You've done a really good view. You understand our business, and analytics is nice to have. Just looking at the business model you've got, you forgot our consulting business. I went, what? Yeah, this is a chemical company with a
Yeah.
consulting business. He said, I've got 4,000 consultants that I've got out in our customers, understanding their needs and working on it. I don't know
Yeah.
where they are and how they account for their time. I don't know what they're doing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. At the end of that, we ended up, I think, with about a €5 million deal to go sell SAP's project management and consulting software. Now,
Yeah.
the lesson there is we were trying to sell analytics. The lesson there is don't assume you know the company better than the person you're talking to. And don't worry if you get it wrong. If you present back a well thought through, intelligent view of why and what the company does and how they do it, they're going to lean in and start giving you the nuggets. It's often the stuff that you have left out that are the nuggets of gold
Yeah.
that really drive the value creation. And that was a huge lesson to me. And it was borderline. It's always good to leave something out of a presentation. Your prospect or your customer will lean in and fill in the gaps for you. You don't want to always do that, because occasionally you'll come across as ill-educated or just not paying attention. But there's a fine line there. But huge lesson there. My assumption was I knew that business better than they did. Clearly wasn't the case. And there were 4,000 or 5,000 consultants that obviously hadn't been
Didn't know
touched.
they existed.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So that
Yeah.
was a fascinating story, that one. And needless to say that I wasn't the sales guy on that, but the sales guy on that one was delighted with the approach that we took and the fact
Sure.
we'd left out that and had an opportunity to go and sell I think it's about €5 million. And
That's
it was
a
a
big
decent
deal.
deal.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it's one of those pieces that what came up for me as you were sharing that. I see too many organizations who are built towards a pit. Honestly, I've never pitched anything in my life. I've been
Yep.
in sales for 25 years. I've never done a pitch. Presented, I've talked to I've done a first call deck, which is, hey, let's just have a starting point for a conversation.
Mhm.
Even if you're presenting an RFP, like it's fighting that standard or that voice that's saying, I think they want me to go and talk about these things.
Yep.
Now they want to have a conversation with you. Like they want to actually have a two-way engagement. They want a partner. They want someone who's going to work with them. It's not just, I've seen, I did experience early in my career, I worked for marketing agencies, and they would go in and do pitches. I wasn't on that side of the business, and I could never understand it.
Mm.
And I was like, how do you, like, it's throwing mud at the wall
Mhm.
and hoping that your ideas would work. And then we actually had some reasonable leaders come to that business and completely transformed how they were doing it. And they got rid of pitches. They would, let's have a collaborative engagement around what we want to build, and we'll build you an outcome to your
Yep.
problem.
Yep.
Like, I think all that stuff is so important, right?
I think certainly in the context of where we live in Australia, most executives just hate being sold to. It debases them. And it's just, I don't want that. I want to value the conversation I have with you. And I
Yep.
think as a sales professional, if you're genuinely curious and engaging and you lean in, that's where you find the nuggets, and that's where you start adding value. And that's the difference between a 10K deal and a $1 million deal. You're
Yeah.
really adding a ton of value.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
Mate, should we flip this on its head?
I was about to say the same thing. So yeah, like I'll give everyone the 10-cent tour of my background. And like I've been in, unlike you, I've been in sales my entire career. And I never planned to be in sales. It
Mhm.
wasn't like I was at school and said I want to be a salesman. I got a job out of uni. I had to find my way to buy myself beers on a Friday night. And I sold mobile phones, of all things, at retail store. My first job was actually at a Motorola. My first sales job was actually at a Motorola Level C service center. And when people would come in with a broken phone, they needed a bloke standing at the front counter who could sell a phone.
Do you remember
I
your first
started-
sale?
It was a replacement handset, and it was actually, this is how long ago it was. It was one of the big old, like long rectangular bricks with the big aerials
Mhm.
on top. And I had this guy he crushed it. He'd driven a truck over it. And it's still, this is how good these mobiles were. We all laugh now at iPhones and Androids and stuff, how quickly the screens break. He'd driven his truck over it, and it was just the fact that he grated the front off it and went, "Oh, it's not worth replacing. It's not worth fixing. I'll buy a new one." But he goes, "This is great. I grab it by the aerial and I'll chuck it in the back of the tray." That's how robust those things are. But he driven his truck over it. That was my first sale.
Yep, this one.
Mate, yeah, break your cherry, so to speak. But no, I spent another sort of 3 or 4 years when I was at university working in mobiles, selling in different locations around Sydney. And then finished university, had an economics degree from Sydney Uni. Don't know how, it was in business. That was as close as I could think about what I was doing. Spent almost a year as an insurance broker, of all things, selling credit insurance, and looked around and went, I'm not an insurance broker. I've got no interest in doing this whatsoever. Then spent a couple of years working for one of the agencies under the Clemenger brand. I got bought by Clemenger just after I left, but they were a field marketing experience agency. So we used to look after how people working in retail channel would experience Samsung and Optus or mobiles when you walk into store. Did a big project for Westfield shopping centers around the globe, which was pretty interesting. So at one point I had 1,000 mystery shoppers and orders a month going into Westfield shopping centers around the world, which is pretty cool. And then stepped out of that and joined Nikon Cameras, of all places, and was looking after their regional sort of operational sales team. Left that, went across and worked for Hasbro Toys, selling action figures and things for a year into Toys R Us and Woolworths and a whole bunch of different places. As fun as that sounded, it wasn't.
Wouldn't have been nice.
It wasn't that fun, actually. It wasn't my bag at all.
You didn't get the stuff too either.
Yeah. And then spent 3 years running my own company. We bought the division of it. My father and I bought a division of a appliance company that was going broke. And we turned the repair division into a national appliance repair company with a sideline for replacing appliances and selling spare parts. And that's how I actually got into tech, would you believe? Again, you said before, like as you plot your trajectory, and I hear people joining early in their careers going, what's the pathway? There's no pathway. You'll work it out on the way. Anyone who tells you there's a pathway is kidding.
Mate, you've got mobile phones, action figures, cameras.
Yeah, and then I'm in tech now, right? And so how I got in tech was I had to run this company. And so I had to bootstrap. How did I build I didn't know what a CRM was. And I've got customers and I need some way of tracking them and billing them and working it out and outsourcing it out to our contractors. And stumbled on a CRM, and that was Salesforce, and did the world's quickest RFP in about 15 minutes and said, oh, Google's a customer. If Google have done the assessment, this kit must be all right. I'll buy that.
Was the sales cycle a good one? Do you remember being sold to?
I was sold to by a guy who I believe actually is a listener to the podcast, a guy called Imran Ali. He's been around
Imran
for a while. He's been at
Imran was in
DocuSign
my
and
inside
different
sales
places.
team at SAP too.
There you go. Yeah, Imran did the sales cycle for me. And again, that was helped by one of our good friends, Paul Mansfield. He was my SI at the time, delivered that project. And again, the core lesson that I learned on that one, I turned around to Paul about a year and a half later and said, mate, what? You built this CRM for me and now I've learned all these other things. Why didn't you build that for me at the beginning? He said, because if I'd told you to do all those things, you never would have launched the project. You weren't ready to hear about it because that wasn't the problem you were solving yet. The problem you were solving was getting up and running fast and just getting phase one done. I went, yeah, that's
Great
fair.
advice. Great
Yeah,
advice.
and I've remembered that so many times. It's like if you can scare a customer away because you know where this is going to go. They're not ready to hear that yet.
Oh, how many times have you had a salesperson in your team that pitches to absolutely everything you can do that's just
Yeah.
nowhere near what the client is trying to solve? And but it's
No,
because their
no,
widget's really cool.
just sell the bit they need to buy or the function they need to buy. That's all they care about.
Yep.
So did that. And then actually a guy called Tony Armfield, who's now over at IBM, I believe.
Yep.
I was doing a whole bunch of different bits and pieces for custom references for Salesforce and some cool videos that were very cool. He joked to me one day and said, "Oh, make more than this half my sales guys do. Why aren't you working for me?" And I said, "Oh, when I sell the company, I'll tap you on the shoulder." And I got some advice a couple of years later, a couple of months later almost, that said, if you're going to sell a company, and it's never my long-term dream to run an appliance repair company, you need to fire yourself. So when you sell the business, you don't go with it. I went, that's good advice. So I did. I fired myself and went and got a job at Salesforce. Tony referred me in. Joined Charlie Wood's team in Radian 6 and spent a couple of years traversing through the marketing cloud business as Radian 6 became Radian 6 Plus Buddy Media as a social marketing cloud, and then ExactTarget got acquired into the business, and then stepped across into Core with you, which was pretty cool. And then obviously across into Financial Force and then off into Conga, and now I'm out searching for the next great engagement of whatever life's going to look like, doing some work in the sort of the startup land, which is pretty cool. But yeah, look, it's been an interesting journey to get to where I am having now, looking back on 15 years in tech, enterprise, so everything from selling action figures through to and selling individual transactions to mobile phones as a kid, now to selling multi-million-dollar enterprise deals. It's an interesting piece that I think doesn't matter what size the sale is.
Mm-hmm.
There might be more voices in the process, but the concept's always so similar.
Yep.
And when you break it down to the individual transaction, there is always still one person on the other side who is fundamentally making a decision on this is the right way or that's the right way. Maybe there's a couple of voices in an enterprise conversation to make sure you've validated all the different directions.
Mm-hmm.
9 times out of 10, there's one decision maker that's saying that's the right direction to go in.
And I think it's such a good lesson, right? You got to put yourself in the mind of that decision maker. They've got 3 or 4 alternative solutions to buy. There's trust. But what are some of the things you put yourself? You were at Aussie White Goods. You were buying Salesforce. What was front of center for you in terms of make a decision?
Mate, it's a lesson that I've shared with so many different people over time. I really learnt hard when I was running my own company. Everybody thinks the biggest competitor is some other solution in your space. It's not. The biggest competitor is always do nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And the biggest competitor is the fact that the executive that you're talking to versus engaging with you and buying your solution has just got other priorities.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying that you won't lose a deal. Everyone loses a deal to a competitor every now and again. But that's because that's where the actual conversation was happening. It's not, we talk about tender fodder and those types of things in the sales cycle, right? Someone else was leading the charge on that conversation. And the real assessment that the organization or the individual was having was, do I buy this? Do I partner with these people to deliver that outcome? Or do I just focus my time and effort doing something else completely?
Mm-hmm.
Or just keep doing what I'm doing today?
So tell me,
if you conquer those, that's the game.
When Imran came and pitched Salesforce to you and you were thinking to yourself, do I do nothing? Do I listen to this guy that's talking about CRM and what it can do for my business and how it tracks my customer engagement? What were some of the messages he gave you that really said, you know what, I'm not going to do nothing?
Yeah, look, I think I presented him a problem, which was, hey, look, I've just built this company overnight and bought some assets, and I'm going to have to turn the phones on in 5 days' time.
Mm-hmm.
And right now, my plan to manage the inflow of customers is a wad of paper and some faxes or emails.
Mm.
Like that model, while painful, will work.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a thing here that you can help me on, educate me on what I don't know, and then I can make a conscious decision around, do I spend the next couple of months getting that right or getting something else?
Mm-hmm.
And what he painted for a picture for me was, okay, in your business, these are the types of things that are going to happen. Now, look, I was in a pretty unique scenario that we bought some assets. We knew we had a big guess. We're going to have a whole bunch of traffic on day one, which was helpful. He was able to paint a picture for me that said, look, these are the things that are likely to happen. And as a result of these things happening, then these are the things that will happen. Like these are the problems you'll have on top of that. Here are a couple of different ways you can solve those problems. This is how we do it. And the time frame to solve it with us looks like this.
Mm-hmm.
The investment looks like this. And then we brought up some additional issues. I didn't want to pay any money because I didn't have any revenue yet. I had no idea what the revenue would look like on the other side. We pushed on him with payment terms and what's our commitment time frame and what happens if I grow astronomically? What's this going to look like if I've got 50 people in 6 weeks' time?
Mm-hmm.
Like he solved some problems for me, which is he's a great sales guy. But it was always around, like they're problems for tomorrow. But this is how we alleviate your immediate problem right now.
Yep. It's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a really interesting experience, kind of being on the side of actually buying the software yourselves. And that was the other interesting conversation that I never forget. At the time, Xero was really early, and I was quite keen for us to use Xero.
Mm-hmm.
But it was early in its trajectory, and my old man pulled me aside and he said, "Are you going to do the accounting?" I said, "No." He said, "Okay, cool." And we were sharing an account. He had a legal practice. We were sharing office space and stuff. And he pulled me over, and a lovely girl called Cheryl was running the books. He said, "Cheryl, what accounting package do you use every day?" She goes, "I use MYOB." "Okay, cool. Have you ever used Xero?" She goes, "No, never used Xero." And he turned to me and he said, "So are you training her?" I said, "No." And I went, "Fair enough. Decision made."
So
And
you think through there. You're an MYOB rep and you're a Xero rep.
yeah.
And you're calling on your company.
Yeah. Like when you think, so at that point in time, the decision had nothing to do with whether MYOB or Xero was a better solution.
Mm-hmm.
It had nothing to do with, was it cheaper? Were the payment terms good? Was the integration better? Was the product better? Time, effort, and money.
Mm-hmm.
I was not going to spend the time, and I definitely wasn't going to spend the effort worrying about retraining my 30-year experienced accounts person on a new platform.
There you go.
Just
there's a lesson there, right?
done. Like that's 100% lesson, right?
It's not about the widgets.
It's not about the widgets. In that engagement, it was to the Xero rep trying to sell it to me. That was against do nothing because my accountant already had an instance of Xero. It didn't cost me any money. And we still had to pay a license and buy a new org and all that type of stuff. We had to pay money for it. But the decision was a competitive engagement against do nothing.
Yes.
They didn't get beaten by MYOB.
Of course
they got
not.
beaten by do nothing.
Yeah.
So I think
let's roll forward a little bit. Walk me through one of your favorite sales cycles. What went well? What would you do differently?
Look, one of my favorite personal sales cycles, I did a big deal. The biggest deal I did as an individual contributor with a very, very large North American fast food outlet that sells hamburgers. But like that, the deal that I loved about that was we competed against everybody. It was as they were kind of moving into how do they bring their customer experience, their transaction at the register into the 21st century.
Mm-hmm.
How do you do it on an app, or how do you move it away from a 14-year-old having to stand there and punch your order to doing it yourself and putting screens at the front, etc. And they were very early in their journey, but they brought everybody in: Microsoft, Oracle, SAP, Salesforce, etc. And early on in the engagement, and look, at that stage, Salesforce was probably the smallest player in region by a long way, like by 10x smaller than everybody else. And the brief we got was it was brief. It was on one page. And I was like, where's the rest of this brief? There's got to be more detail to this problem statement. And what I think, the bit that I look back on that, and actually I've worked with a guy we both know, Peter Reed, on this. And the bit that I loved about the engagement that we had was we worked out that not only did they not know the brief themselves, somebody else owned this brief and everybody else was madly trying to discover from the customer themselves, not actually understanding how this customer operated. And this particular customer had two marketing agencies that basically had run this business for 50 plus years.
Mm-hmm.
That's how long the relationships were. So we went, okay, this is actually about changing customer experience. It's about marketing. It's about getting a data set underneath it. We spent all like 85% of our time delving into building a relationship with these two marketing agencies.
Mm-hmm.
And we then worked out that no, and they said, you're the only people talking to us. I went, okay, cool. All right, this is our bet. This is our bet that we think this is the right way to go about it. Now we're chasing CIOs and heads of marketing, and we gave you a one-page brief. We have no idea what we're doing here. We don't know what the problem is here. We just know we need to go and do something different. And what we found out on the pathway was the day before we were all presenting, and it was a showdown. And again, I go back to the fact I said before, I've never pitched. But the showdown was all these different agencies the different vendors walking in to talk to these guys. The day before, the two agencies met with the customer and educated them on what the problem was, what they had to go and solve, how to go about it, what the play of the market was like, and what their recommendation was on a solution.
Mm-hmm.
We built the recommendation of the solution for them.
Yep.
So
there's
we
a lesson there, isn't
presented
there?
the next day. And again, we didn't present. We came in and we had a collaborative discussion with them and walked them basically back through and what they had learned the day before as to what all their problems were. And it was like, hey, great, tell us about your problems. And this is what it is. And they told us, and great. And amazing. This next slide looks exactly what you need to let it look like.
Mm-hmm.
And then here's the architecture diagram of how you would solve based on that.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the meeting, they stopped us and they went, how did you know that's what it was? And I said, we've spent 8 weeks talking to your partners. And they went, oh, you actually understand us.
Yeah.
You understand our business. So that was an interesting one. But there were some other great pieces of that particular deal that I experienced and loved, which was how to manage executives when you're in a larger organization, even in a smaller one. How do you manage up internally? Like one of the big problems we had in that particular deal was there were a lot of other parts of the Salesforce platform that wanted to be hung on this deal, and they probably weren't relevant. A big part of that was managing some executives and some egos around how do we get our logo attached to this engagement. And there was one particular meeting where I recall this like it was yesterday, and I worked out halfway through the meeting that the CMO who was paying for all this just was not swallowing what our particular executive was putting down in the meeting. And I had to pivot, and knew after the meeting I was going to get literally yelled at or torn a new one. And copped it on the way home in the taxi, on the way back to the office in the taxi, and walked back in to see my own leader at the time, who went, I've just got this text message. What happened? Walked him back through what happened. He went, yeah, okay. You've had to fall on the sword on that one. Fair enough. But look, we won the deal. At the time, it was someone did surpass it not very long afterwards, but at the time, it was the single largest deal we'd done in my part of Salesforce at the time, which was pretty cool. But it was a big deal. Like there were lots and lots of moving pieces to it.
Some good lessons there. Look,
Massively.
I think influence the influencers. Actually, who are the influencers?
Yeah.
Because they're not the people you think they are.
Yeah.
And I guess the other one is curiosity, right? You really wanted to understand the problem, and it wasn't on that one pager. So you talked to people that were influencing the company you were selling to.
Yeah.
50-year relationship is not one to ignore, really.
Yeah. And one of the things that we also did that now that I think about it, we didn't just follow the bouncing ball that the customer had given us, which was, there was at the start of it, here's the one-page brief. Here's the things that you're going to go and do in the meetings we'll have. We just ignored it. We asked them for the meetings that we needed to have to be able to do our bit. We went and asked for more information. We sought out what was necessary for us to build a view of what was right. And we never just accepted the fact that we couldn't ask more.
Yep. Absolutely. So look, interesting. I think no two sales cycles are the same, but I guess the one that I mentioned before, being curious, not knowing the business, but being open to understanding what was not uncovered, from your perspective, that one was amazing. I love the fact that you identified that there was an influencer outside the company that had a long business history with them, that probably had a good understanding of the business outcomes they wanted, not the widgets they needed to buy. And you pivot your talk track to that. And I think as a salesperson, you don't get it particularly often, but when you present and your prospect says, "How did you know that? How did you know that?" You're in a
Yeah.
pretty good spot, right? And
Yeah.
your slides or your presentation themes are 100% spot on. I guess pivoting, have you ever done a presentation where it 100% missed the mark?
Yes.
We both have, I know.
Look, one thing before I jump into these where they've completely missed the mark, and in fact, I'll tell you one that I missed the mark on that we ended up closing. In fact, this story, one of the things I'll say that salespeople and people in business really should remember, you're going to lose more deals than you win.
Mhm.
And that's a function of the way that sales works. If you're closing more than 30% of your total pipeline, you are a superstar.
Mhm.
Either that or you're fudging your numbers a bit.
Yep.
So that's the first piece. But there was a particular printing company out of Melbourne who've now been acquired and done some other things anyway. And like we were pitching for their ERP business and their billing business. And we dropped the ball so hard on the presentation. Look, there were some technical problems in gaps in our product
Mhm.
that we as a solution just stepped around. And the guy at the time, the customer who was owning the process, rang us back and just went, "Mate, that was horrendous.
Mhm.
Like you didn't answer any of the things that we needed us to do." And I knew on the call, I went, "This has just gone pear shaped."
Mhm.
The thing that we did that saved that deal, and it's a really I've never I don't know how I came up with this at the time or if I heard it off someone. We asked for a do-over. Like we actually just said to the customer, "Do you know what? I don't want you to make a decision based on my shitty work." And I
Mhm.
think I was off on a completely different pathway here. And if you're going to make a decision on what you're going to do moving forward, that shouldn't be based on the fact that maybe I dropped the ball.
Mhm.
That was like a patent like disrupt. They
Mhm.
stopped. Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you know
I
what's
said, so like,
interesting? I remember that, and I, with all due respect, already decided what the problem was,
yes,
and it was
100%.
a web thing, right? And
Yeah,
I've done that before. I think we all have, right? You have this tweak in your brain. You go, "I know what they want," and
yeah.
then everything else that hits you after that is just noise,
Was just noise.
and
Yeah,
then you just turn up and do what you assume is the right outcome, and it's just
yep.
not listening.
Yeah, the questions we'd asked, we prepared answers to, and we were just not, was they wanted some really basic functionality covered off for us, and we just hadn't done it. They asked us for it, we weren't listening to it, and we ignored it. And like the patent disrupt was, I just said, "Look, I don't want you to make a decision that's going to impact your business based on me being bad at my job for this bit. I'm going to make an unreasonable request, and can we do it again?" And the customer went, "Yeah, I think that's actually a really good thing to do because
Mhm.
I don't want to go and advise my CEO that because Bartels did a shit job, we've now gone on this other pathway and not looked at all the right data and not had a good engagement." He said, "Okay,
Mhm.
but what I'm going to need are these things." And
Mhm.
great, and we went and delivered on those things. And even in the second engagement with them, it was significantly better, but it
Mhm.
wasn't all the way there.
Yep.
But because we'd now built this kind of back and forward relationship in terms of getting them the outcome, they went, "Okay, we can actually see that there's a potential that you could do these things, but we haven't seen them. And we actually want to see it like this."
Mhm.
And it allowed us to have some much more open conversations around what was there and what needed to be built and what would come in deployment that we would than you'd normally have.
Mhm.
But it was a conversation. It wasn't a pitch.
Yeah.
But I got to say, there was a deal. It was a deal we won, and it was one of the better deals we ended up winning. But it definitely was lost before it was won.
Yeah. But I
Um,
think you asked me before, what advice do you give
mm,
salespeople? Don't give up. With
yeah,
respect, don't give up. And
a deal's not lost until it's lost. Until someone's actually decided this is it. Out. Thank you very much. We just got to go and
yep,
spend our time and effort somewhere else or buy something else. Whatever it's going to be.
yep. And once that's happened, don't burn bridges. Accept the call went the other way, And it's really important because the executives that you spent the last 6 months building a relationship are going to be somewhere else. You're going to
Yeah.
meet them again, especially in a market like Australia and New Zealand. You're going to run into these people. And I think if you lose a deal with respect, you're probably going to be column A in the next cycle you're in when they move somewhere else. You've done it with respect. You've listened. You've empathized with the problem they're trying to solve. You didn't win this one, maybe in reasons outside of your control. Accept it,
Yep.
move on, and just never burn bridges.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and look, and that custom was pretty problematic, I got to say, through the whole thing. But
Yep.
that
They were
particular
difficult.
executive, I think we were the first or second phone call at the very next job that he had.
Hmm.
Hey, listen, I've got a really similar looking problem. I'm not sure you guys can do it, but can you come in and talk to me about it? And it
Yes.
wasn't just because that was who we had on the Rolodex. It was
Hmm.
because there was a mutual level of, we understood how to work together. We built a level of trust to have proper conversations.
Yep.
And in fact, the other piece I didn't mention, that where we built the greatest level of trust in that first engagement was, we were scared around some functionality, that some requests that they had that we just didn't do.
Hmm.
And we had a lot of, I remember this, a lot of umming and ahhing around how do we manage that conversation. And finally,
Hmm.
I don't recall whether I came up with this or someone else did. Could have been you. We came up with, we just have to tell them we don't do that.
Yep.
We have to tell them we don't have that functionality, and they need
That
to
sounds
make a
like me.
decision. And they need to make a decision
Yeah.
based on, this is what
It's
it
a
is.
workaround. Yep.
And well, it wasn't even a workaround. We can't deliver that for you.
Hmm.
And the feedback from the customer was, he said, that was the moment we trusted you, because you are honest and you are open. And even though we're asking and trying to push you, we knew what the boundaries were now. And now when you were telling us other things that we can do that, because you told us you couldn't do that thing,
Hmm.
we now knew when you were telling us you could do that, you could do it. But before, we were just saying yes to everything. We didn't know what was real and what
Wasn't
wasn't real.
genuine. That's a massive lesson for
Yep.
people. Yeah. In a sales cycle, if you haven't said no at some point, you've got
Yep.
to second guess whether you're going to win this, right?
Yeah. You got to
In
find the
general.
boundaries, 100%.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. I think it's like kids, right? They'll keep asking until you say no.
Absolutely.
What quite often happens in that scenario, I've seen, especially if there's a consulting team to implement, you keep saying yes, the profit margin of your
Just
engagement just gets whittled away in every single
100%.
conversation. And you get to the end of the cycle. If you happen to win it, you wish you'd said no a little bit earlier, because when you do say no, it's often reasonable to say no. It's not reasonable. We've both had small kids. They're just going to keep asking until you say
Yeah.
no. Can I have another lollipop? Yep.
Yep.
Can I have another lollipop? Yep. Even though it's not good for them, you got to say no at some point.
Yeah. You also don't want your first no to be about price.
Yes.
If you haven't
100%.
said no beforehand, that's different things that we can't do. It hasn't set the boundaries of, okay, what can I? Otherwise, the customer has a perception that you can do anything I ask you to. So
100%.
now all of a sudden it becomes super difficult for that first, hey, listen, this is the same as that example we talked about before. I just can't get there.
Yep.
This is the construct I've got to look at, or this is what I need from a profitability perspective. And this is me being truthful. This is not just me saying, I want to make some comp.
Yep.
Like that, if you haven't pushed back earlier, that becomes like a really difficult conversation.
Boundaries. Another good lesson.
The question. So we've obviously given a bunch of advice and shared some stories, but as we ask all of our guests when they come on, one lesson on our way out for our listeners that they should take away out of today's session, or just a key lesson for their careers.
As a salesperson, won't repeat some of the ones I've said before, but look, remember that you're selling to human beings that have
Yeah.
needs, desires, ups and downs, good days, bad days. I think part of your job as a salesperson is part psychologist and part problem solver. Don't forget you're part psychologist. There's a lot you can do to help your prospect and customer by empathizing with them, understanding what motivates them, really be there for them. And I think I've had an interaction with a pretty senior security officer at one of the major banks in the last couple of weeks. And my message was, look, I'd love to talk to you about whether I can solve a problem for you. But if you're not ready, it's okay. And I'm keen to keep the dialogue going. And if you just want thought leadership around how you solve the problem in general, I'm here for you. And I think that's a lesson, right? Hopefully that builds rapport and trust, but you're dealing with a human being and they have exactly the same up days and down days that you do. And just remember that when you're selling. Dan, over to you, mate. What's a lesson from you?
Mate, I'm gonna extrapolate on the one lesson you just gave. Everybody you're dealing with on the customer side, they're just a person.
Mhm.
Doesn't matter what their title is. They're a man, a woman, a mum, a dad, whatever they're going to be. They've got kids, they've got a problem, they've got challenges at home, the dog's sick this week, can't pay the mortgage. Like all those things come into, doesn't matter what role they've got. Yeah, people, the more senior up the channel, up the pyramid, they've just got more emails in their inbox. They've just got more challenges on their time. They're not different or unique or
Mhm.
often do they even know more about the problem than those below them? Quite often not.
Mm.
By all means, look at the context, but don't be afraid of talking to whoever you need to talk to.
Yep.
Doesn't matter what role you've got, whether you're a BDR, a strategic AE, or a CEO of a company, you've got every right to be able to talk to anyone you want to talk to on the other side. By all means, build a plan between your team around who talks to who. So you just got a structure around it, but don't be afraid to talk to whoever you want to talk to. You'll be amazed who'll take your phone call. You'll be amazed who'll answer your email or your email.
Yep.
Like that's one, I think, one of the key lessons for anybody out there from a sales perspective.
Absolutely, Dan. Good advice, mate. And
Yeah.
I'll summarize that. Be a good human. Being
Yeah.
an asshole will never get you a sale.
100%, mate. On that, everyone, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of GrowthPulse, the B2B sales podcast. If you're watching us on YouTube, please make sure you've subscribed. Click that like button. Give us a comment if you can. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple or any of your other podcast audio networks, click the plus sign so we can let you know when the next episode comes out. Thanks everybody for joining the latest episode.